At first, it was an adventure. The start of my mission, at the heart of the system, where you get a chance to listen, advance in vision, learn your task and life's ambition so you can make the right decision. When I was 15, school felt oppressive, and this one maths teacher was a manic depressive, a victim asleep and a passive aggressive. He'd rather me out his class than in his lesson. And that was it. No more maths for me. Spiraling out of control in the hope to feel free. Bunking one lesson turned into most a week, you see. A classroom is a classroom where thriving minds come to expand and grow, where seeds get sown, but from all walks of life these feet have grown. Some get beat, some get treats at home. Some might see the right path, some might need to be shown. Some teachers see the signs, some just don't. Some show their care inside, some just won't. A true teacher provides their students' lives with hope, doesn't undermine or make you feel alone, doesn't clip your wings before you've flown. A true teacher looks you in the eye and says, find your dreams and fly. Cares, actually wants to share their time. It's so much more than just a 9 to 5. You're guiding lives. I can't's just short for I can try. Teamwork makes the dream work, comes to mind. Now that's worth an underline. The best teacher I ever had showed me the magic in life, made me grateful that I got eyes and hands to write, helped me find my innocence in a young corrupted mind, highlighted the demons in gun crime, made me happy, brought me sunshine. It's mad how one word, one line can change somebody's whole life.
Teach First. And what's so exciting about it is that it was completely written, produced, directed, filmed, performed by teenagers who went to Teach First schools, and the quality is so much better than anything we were able to put on ourselves. It blows me away. You know, it shouldn't blow me away because it's just another example that all of us know that the young people we're working with are so much more talented than often society or many people might give them credit for. I was going to tell 3 stories today, and the theme of all 3 stories were similar. The idea that from small acorns, great trees grow, and just because something's true at one point in time doesn't mean it has to be true in the future, and things can change. And the first story I was going to tell sort of made me think is a good story for New Zealand. It's something I saw a few months ago. When I lived in Hawaii for a few years, and my aunt married a native Hawaiian, and I have cousins my age, and they have children who all live in a small island, Molokai, that is almost all native Hawaiian. And my cousin there is actually principal of a Hawaiian language immersion school. It was interesting, I visited him and his school with my family a few months ago, and what was interesting with this school is for people to know that Hawaiian language came very close to dying out. I think it was one of these languages very, very close to dying out only about 30 or 40 years ago. And I think like many languages around the world, we have English as the main language. You know, it struggled for a long time. I think for a long time it was banned in society. There's all sorts of problems behind it. And about 34 years ago, there's a real tension about would it die out completely. And in the last 20 years, there's been Hawaiian immersion schools. There's been a whole new sort of renaissance, I would say, of teaching it to young children. And my cousin's principal of a high school that teaches in Hawaiian. And when I spoke to him, he said, do you know, we recently had some visitors who helped me set up this school and figure out the curriculum. And I was like, oh, okay, where are they from? He's like, well, yeah, they're from your country, from Wales. And I was like, Wales, what are they doing here? And it turned out, it's another part of the story that, for people who know in the UK, and I looked up in Wikipedia, it says New Zealand has the 4th most Welsh speakers in the world. So that's a fun fact of the day. Welsh was also a language that was sort of, had this, big, obviously English is the main language nearby, potentially dying out, potentially lost, and in the past decades, Welsh people have actually reclaimed the language, have now made it a real national language. It's now one of the UK's 2 official languages, and according to the recent Welsh Language Act, everything has to be in Welsh. You go to Wales and teach first is currently in Wales, and we translate our materials into Welsh. We have Welsh language teachers. It's a really living language now in a way that I think in previous decades it was close to not being. And my cousin and a number of the people who were trying to get Hawaiian language restarted in Hawaii brought some of these experts from Wales into Hawaii to help them learn how they could do something similar in Hawaiian that had happened in Welsh. And I was thinking that's a great Kiwi story, 2 great cultures, the Polynesian and the Welsh culture, how they had learned from each other and one had helped the other to make change happen and to reclaim their heritage. And I was thinking, it's a great example of how change can happen. And it's also a great example of how people can learn from each other in the most unlikely places and really to help each other, to make a better future for themselves. So that was the one story, which I thought was really interesting. And I think for this, it's a great example of Sean coming to that meal, and I do remember that meal 5 or 6 years ago, and saying, he wanted to start something similar in New Zealand, and me thinking, yeah, whatever. Crazy things before they get in the classroom. And now seeing this great guy, this great alumni at Teach First, come and actually take his vision and make it a reality, take it from one part of the world and move it to a completely different part of the world. And I think that sort of global learning is just a great example, especially the 21st century, when we're all learning from each other. So that was one story. The second story is a story of how things have changed and how, from small acorns, great trees have grown. There's a story of Teach First. And when we started Teach First 11 years ago, it was seen as a very unlikely initiative, very, very unlikely. And there were 5 reasons people told me it was impossible. And I write about this in my book. And the first reason people said it was impossible was, this sort of organization just wouldn't get started. You just wouldn't be able to bring together all the different interest groups. You just don't start these sort of charities in the UK. It just wouldn't happen. And what happened, it wasn't easy, just like I'm sure it hasn't been easy in New Zealand when we got started. We got turned down from the ministry the first time. We had all sorts of interest groups who were very worried about it, who were very interested, but concerned in different ways. We had to raise money from people without really any proof of concept. We had to really explain, that on the one hand, we wanted to get people who would make real change happen, who would change things. On the other hand, we wanted to do it in a very respectful, humble way that would be collaborative in the whole education profession. And that's a very difficult message to give. And the first time the minister turned us down, we had a meeting with the schools minister. I brought all my supporters in there. We sat down with him, and he said at that point, it's not going to happen. He said, you're not going to do this. We don't think this is going to work. And then he left. And at that point, one of my mentors said to me, all right, this looks like the end, doesn't it? And I said, yes, it does. Everyone sort of, said it's not going to happen. And he said, does this feel more like a cliff, or does this feel more like a valley? And I said, I don't really understand what that means. If it feels like a cliff, you're dead. Do you feel like this is dead, this idea? Or do you feel like it's a valley? And the great thing about valleys, and actually he's Welsh, so he knows that. The great thing about valleys is you can climb out of valleys. There's always a way to climb out of a valley. If you fall off a cliff, you're dead, unless you're in New Zealand and you have a bungee cord or something. For the most part, you don't survive falling off cliffs. But valleys you survive, you can climb out of. And does this feel like a cliff or a valley? And we said, it's a valley, it has to be a valley. So then we said, okay, how do we climb out of this valley? We got a whole strategy. We spent the next few weeks determining how we need to get the right civil servants on board, how we need to get the right supporters on board, and we ended up climbing out of that valley, and now we call that our valley of death at Teach First. And I always tell our new teachers, during your time in the classroom, you will have valleys of death, whether that's riots over lollipops or something going in the classroom. That's just a constant of every first teacher at all times. And the question when you hit those valleys of death, do you feel it's a cliff or a valley? And if you feel it's a valley, then you just need to think, I'm going to climb out of this. And how am I going to get those young people to help me climb out of it? How am I going to climb out of it with those young people to get to the hill of happiness on the other side? So that was the first reason people say it wouldn't happen. There are 5 reasons. The second reason people said Teach First wouldn't happen was because of me. They said, look, you're 26, I was 26 at the time, you're not British, you have no educational experience, you're about the most unqualified person imaginable for this sort of thing. You're not going to get this started. And I would have agreed with them. And I think, to me, the lesson I took from that was, by myself, I wouldn't have gotten it started. But like what I've seen at TFNZ and like the great allies Sean's brought together and the great, wonderful collaborative group that I see in this room, this isn't something that any one person could get started. This has to be something that people work together towards. And to me, it was sort of the integrity of understanding my own weaknesses, my own strengths, and bringing together more and more allies behind that vision we have, that all children should get the education they deserve, that all children's education shouldn't depend on their socioeconomic background. And it was only by bringing those people together, the mentors, the allies, the great supporters from all different angles who had that ownership of the program, that I feel like I was able to learn enough to lead it. And obviously 11 years later, I'm still learning as we grow and still improving and trying to figure out how I could make this work. The third reason people gave why Teach First wouldn't work was recruitment. And I remember meeting the head of career services at a very prestigious university, which the university is much older than the United States. It's much older than New Zealand. And sitting there with his books and everything saying, you don't understand British graduates. British graduates, they're very selfish. They're very interested in money. And they're not into all this idealism that people in other countries are into. They just want to make as much money as possible, especially my graduates. And last year there were about 5 of my graduates who went off to teach in low-income school. Most of them, were Christian and wanted to become priests. Actually, it's just not a normal thing, right? And many heads of career services said that to me, that this just wouldn't happen in Britain. And what I was interesting is these were the experts, right? These were the people who were the biggest experts on what British graduates wanted, and they were absolutely, completely wrong. They underestimated their graduates. They underestimated the British young people, just like many of us underestimate the young people who made that video or in many of our schools. They underestimated them, and what we learned very quickly is actually, just like in New Zealand, graduates in Great Britain, they want to make a difference. They want those leadership opportunities. They want to be able to change people's lives. That is something that they're passionate about. And whether it's been strong economic times or recession economic times, we've already seen thousands and thousands of British graduates who see this as the best opportunity available to them, because it is. Teaching in a challenging school or teaching in a low-income school is the best leadership opportunity graduates can possibly have. There's no better leadership opportunity in the country or in the world, I would say. And this year, 10% of that person's university graduates apply to Teach First. So it begins with a C. Far the biggest recruiter of that university's graduates this year. The third reason people said it wouldn't work was the program, right? And there's almost like something you would never be able to train these graduates to teach those kids. These sort of top graduates, these people, they can't really teach those kids from those backgrounds. They have nothing in common. You'll never be able to train them. It's just completely different, right? And I think there's a bit of British class system in there. There's all sorts of things in there. But part of it was, I think, a lack of creativity, a lack of idea that actually you get the right people, you really train them, you just give them a lot of support, because everyone needs a lot of support to be a successful teacher. It's not an easy job. They can be successful. And we only were able to overcome that in the same way that TFNZ has, by partnering with some really good universities. At first we partnered with Canterbury Christchurch University, and the dean there was very visionary and worked very closely with us. Now we partner with 11 or 12 universities, partnering with businesses, partnering with leadership institutes, partnering with in-school mentors, experienced teachers in the schools, and realizing, again, it takes a village to train a teacher. It's not a one-person thing. And creating that collaborative environment where we said, look, we want to recruit these great people, but these great people need lots and lots of support and training from lots of different areas in order to be those really effective classroom leaders that those children need them to be. And by doing that, we've managed to create a really strong training program. 2 years ago, Ofsted, the National Inspectorate, gave us outstanding in all 44 categories. So we had 44 areas, and we got the highest ranking in all 44 areas of our training. And recently, there was the Institute of Education inspection of the impact of Teach First, which was very strong, saying the statistically significant evidence of the strong academic impact our teachers are making, even in their first and second year in the classroom. And that's a whole department's impact. So actually, the impact our teachers make isn't just in their classroom, but in the whole department very early on. And I think that's partly because they work closely in a collaborative way with the entire department, kind of helping everyone raise their game. And there's some really exciting results there. And then the fifth reason people said Teach First wouldn't work was because they said, look, in Britain, people don't have long-term involvements with clubs. It's not a country of joiners. It's not a country of people like visionaries, not a country of that sort of things, you know, or movements or things like that. I mean, first of all, that's not true. You know, historically, Britain has lots of movements if you look at the history of it. But what we found is actually that's absolutely not true among our cohorts. And I mean, I already see there's a few 2003 participants in this room today of our very first cohort. There's a number of our other alumni ambassadors in this room today. We call our alumni ambassadors of Teach First because I don't like using the word alumni because alumni feels you're finished with something. And I say we're like more like a mafia or something. You never get to leave it. You know, you have to stay as an ambassador of Teach First the rest of your life and an ambassador for this mission. And just thinking how many ambassadors are in this room today. But actually that 85 to 90% of our ambassadors are staying involved with this vision, with this mission, with our work, with Teach First. And over time we now have over 5,000 people who feel this commitment, not just to Teach First the charity, but to our vision, you know, that no child's educational success should be limited by their background. And that's a very powerful group that's being created, a very powerful group in Britain, which is just expanding, and is, I think, just at the tipping point of making real national change happen. And what we've seen actually is I think in Britain, and I imagine in New Zealand, people are a nation of joiners. They just need the right thing to join. And once you teach for at least 2 years or more in a low-income community, and you just realize how amazing these young people are, how talented they are, how capable they are, and how, at least in Britain, nationally, so much of that talent is being left to waste, you can't help but for the rest of your life make that a core focus of your existence, of your life. And what we're seeing is among our alumni, our ambassadors, that's what they're feeling. And they feel a huge sense of urgency for the young people they've worked with and for the other young people in the country, which is really exciting. So currently we have alumni doing lots of things all over the country. 85-90% doing something with us or with our mission. A majority of them are staying in schools. Some of the best classroom teachers now. I've seen some amazing classroom teachers. We have about 80 deputy or assistant heads or head teachers. We have now 7 or 8 head teachers of schools, including some of the youngest head teachers in the country, leading some amazing schools. We have some great social entrepreneurs. There's over 30 charities, including TFNZ, that have been started by Teach First alumni, doing some amazing things, from mentoring work with low-income kids to someone who started a social work first, getting people into social work, which is a real issue, to one guy who started an exciting group called Jamie's Farm, which has won all these awards. And his story is that he's a farmer and he taught in inner city London. One day he realized his kids were really stressed all the time. You know, there was a lot of stress. And many of his children were part of gangs, and there's just a lot of things going on with them. And what he did is, I don't think he even told his head teacher at the time, he brought in 2 sheep, somehow, and sort of fenced them off in a corner of the playing field, of the football field. And what he did with his classes, whenever the kids would get a bit, like any child he just thought was really special, he would just have them spend a bit of time with the sheep. And it really worked. And he had the video of talking to his kids, you know, what did them petting the sheep or doing things with sheep do to them? And many of them have never seen a sheep before. And one kid goes, yeah, I was really angry, but then I saw the sheep and I realized you can't be angry at a sheep. It doesn't do anything for you. And since he left Teach First, he started trying to build Jamie's Farm, which has grown and gets inner city children who have really, for the most part, never left the city to spend time at the farm with all sorts of psychotherapy and all sorts of support that helps them, you know, think of new ways of coping with a lot of the problems that they have in their lives. So there's all sorts of those exciting things happen. There's all sorts of politicians, policymakers coming out of Teach First. All sorts of, we have about 15-20% of our people going into the business world. I recently visited Accenture, which has about 40 or 50 Teach First ambassadors working for them. And I met the head of Accenture, and he said, you know, the most popular club at Accenture in London is the Teach First Club. And I hadn't heard that, so what's the Teach First Club? He said, well, I'm a member, almost everyone's a member. It was started by your 40 people here. And basically what it does is it gets Accenture staff to spend a day a fortnight going into low-income schools and doing CV workshops and interview training and talks with kids. And I didn't realize this was happening, but it turned out there's this whole Accenture Teach First Club. They have a newsletter that comes out each week, and they've gotten the entire business of thousands of people involved in these schools. Which is just another exciting story that's come out of all this. So I think that's my second big story that I've seen in England, is that 11 years ago, people thought Teach First wasn't possible. It wasn't something people thought was likely, for all sorts of reasons. It wasn't something that was culturally the norm. Now, in 2013, we are the largest graduate recruiter in the UK. I think we're seen as something that's actually beginning to make real change happen nationally. And there's thousands and thousands of these wonderful, great ambassadors of Teach First who are really making national change happen, which is really exciting. Which leads me to the third story. And the third story is a London-specific story. And to me, this is the most exciting story of them all. When people ask what my highlight is of 11 years of Teach First, this is my highlight. And it's a story of a school, but also a story of a city. So 11 years ago, when I was starting Teach First, when I was looking at what would work, what was the problem, one of the things we did is, as a management consultant, we said, okay, let's look for a really successful low-income school in London. Let's look for a school in London that has lots of children from low-income families, but is doing better than the national average and is doing well. And let's understand why that school is doing well and see what we could use from that to teach other schools. And we could not find one school. We found 0 schools. It's a city of over 8 million people. There was not one school in London, not one, that had a majority of kids from low-income families that was doing better than the national average. So sort of in London, at that point, people thought this was impossible. It was like, a dinosaur running the streets or something, just, it couldn't happen. It wasn't happening. And I visited a number of the schools, and one school I visited in West London always sticks in my mind because it was just so depressing. It was so awfully depressing. Visiting the school, walking around, and seeing the children just being there, being inside a building, the adults who were, responsible for their care, just sort of being there with the young people, nothing really happening, people sort of roaming around, the adults sort of sitting there, nothing was happening there, and it felt like just a prison is the way I describe it, where you were containing people, but not actually trying to get them anywhere. And when I actually asked the head teacher, what's your goal for these kids, his response was, we want to kind of keep them off the streets so they stay out of trouble, right? And that was sort of the extent of the aspiration for those young people. What's exciting to me is 11 years later, what's changed? And what's changed in London and what's changed in that particular school, which I visited again 2 years ago, and I visited actually a number of times recently. What's changed for London, first of all? London is a different city now in teaching. So 10 years ago, it was the lowest performing region in England. Now it's the highest performing region in England. Currently, if you're a child eligible for free school meals living in London, if you're from a poor family in London, on average, you'll do better than the national average, which is just extraordinarily changed. Because there's so many ethnic minorities living in London, currently, most ethnic minorities nationally perform better than white working class, than not just white working class, than white. So there's a recent report that showed of ethnic groups, white was actually the lowest performing ethnic group in England, just about. And that's a complete change from 11 years ago. And that's because so many ethnic minorities live in London. 10 years ago, people were saying London would never do better than it was doing for a number of reasons, because there were so many immigrants there who spoke English as an additional language. There's so much movement around schools, which made things very difficult. It was a struggle to keep talent in London. I remember one head teacher saying, she had to rely on Antipodean, on Kiwi, and Australian staff members who were traveling through London, who would stay for a few months, and if they went home, she'd have to shut down the school because she could not get people who want to teach in that school. Because London was too expensive, there was all sorts of reasons talent wouldn't want to come to London at that point. I think the other reason was because so many wealthy kids were going off to private schools, was another reason London was seen as doing worse than the national average. Now London's doing so much better than the national average, and people are saying, well, of course they're doing better. And I just read an article about this at the left. They have all these great immigrants coming in who have, all these great feelings of wanting to change things, and their parents want them to have great education. They speak all these international languages, which helps their learning. They have experience in all these cultures, which really help. London gets the best talent because talented people want to go to London, nowhere else. Of course it does. And because there's so many private schools around London, state schools can learn a lot from private schools, so that synergies happen. So the exact reason people were saying London was the worst school system in England 10 years ago are the same reason people are saying it's the best school system now. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that has changed. I think we've had actually a lot to do with it. So about 1/10 of all secondary teachers in London are now teach first, over 10 years now. We've built that stock. I think there's great head teachers in London, so the government and a number of external bodies managed to get some great leadership into London. And I think there was something called London Challenge, which got schools to cooperate a lot more over the last 10 years, and as well as set some very minimum standards in London, which has just shot up the entire city. But what that said to me is change can happen. I mean, I've seen it in my eyes with the city I'm living in over the last 10 years. That educational system has changed over 10 years. There's now so many schools in London that's full of children from local communities that are doing really well. And that brings back to the school I visited 11 years ago. So 11 years ago, it was absolutely a very depressing place. I think it would have been about 15 or, I think it was probably single digits, 8-9% of children actually passed their age 16 exams, their GCSEs. Now that school is seen as one of the best schools in the country. It was just recently ranked one of the 50 best schools in the country for various reasons. About 85% of the kids passed their exams. You visit the school, and it is just such an amazing school. About a quarter of the staff are Teach First. They have a wonderful head teacher who's not Teach First, but who's done a number of other things. It is a transformative place, a place anyone would want their child to go. And I tell the story in my book, which was very meaningful for me. When I visited a few years ago, I was chatting to some of the young people there, some of the teenagers. And I said, how is this school? And they're like, oh, it's an amazing school, this is great, and what are you doing? Oh, I'm hoping to go to University of Manchester, I'm hoping to go here, I want to study engineering, I want to study maths, all that sort of stuff. And one of the kids was saying, how great the school was, and I said, wow, has it always been this great, do you think? And one of the kids was like just shaking his head like, no. And I was like, really? Why do you think it's always been this great? He said, look, my older brother went here about 7 years ago. And I was like, really? He's like, yeah, my older brother was here 7 years ago, and it was a mess then. He did lousy, he had no opportunities, and it's just all really sad. And I was like, oh, that is really sad. What's he doing now? And he just didn't want to answer. And then he goes, actually, it turned out he's in jail now. He ended up in a life of crime. And what his brother said, which really sticks with me, was, he's actually much smarter than me also, right? He's actually the smarter brother. And whenever I think, could we wait another year or two? Is it possible to delay this? Whatever I feel like my lack of urgency in this mission lagging, I think about that child, and I think, God, I wish we had been there 7 years earlier. I wish all this other stuff had happened 7 years earlier. I wish the system had changed 7 years earlier, because those adults completely let down that older brother, completely let him down. And luckily they didn't let down his younger brother, and as a result, those two kids have completely different life opportunities now. And that is the story that I always think back to when I think why we need so much urgency in this mission, why we need to start working right away, because these kids have one chance to get that education they need, and that's it. And they need to rely on the adults responsible for that to make it happen. And that's many of you guys in this room, and that's really what I want to say. Thank you, mahalo from the Hawaiian, for joining such a wonderful organization. Mahalo for having that great mission focus, for that sense of urgency, for understanding that you and your colleagues in your schools are the adults who are going to make the difference for these kids. They're going to be the ones who are going to ensure they're on that path, and this is their one opportunity to have that education. So thank you very much.